I am so glad to see so many people here this morning. I always worry about Easter at a UU church, that the humanists won't show up because they might hear about Jesus, and that the Christians among us will visit other churches so they can get their full dose. The Gospel of John reports that Jesus said to his disciples, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these." The idea of works is very important in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is different from the other Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels because they are in sync. They kind of follow the same outline. Mark is the shortest Gospel and probably the pattern from Matthew and Luke, and they follow it, but then they add their own material. Matthew has Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount, like a new Moses coming down from the mountain. Instead of giving 10 commandments, he has Jesus speaking the 9 blessings known as the Beatitudes. Now, Luke has a similar sermon, but he remembers Jesus giving it on the plain, on the same level of the people. And instead of saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," which is Matthew's call to humble reverence, Luke reports Jesus as saying, "Blessed are the poor," indicating Jesus' concern for the poor. And he also reports Jesus saying, "Woe to the rich," showing that Jesus was a revolutionary out to change the social order. Now, these are not necessarily contradictions. It's perfectly possible and probably likely that Jesus gave various versions of the same sermon at various locations. But the gospel writers chose what stories to write down. And this gives the scholars clues to each writer's bias and purpose. And so throughout Matthew, you can see Jesus being presented as the new Moses. He even has Jesus traveling to Egypt so Jesus can come out of Egypt like Moses. Whereas Luke has special material, has Jesus always concerned for the poor and about releasing the captives. And so you can see a little clue into who the authors were and what they thought was important about Jesus. In John, you don't have to kind of search out hints for the author's bias. John himself writes, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. And that idea of having the life of Jesus for the disciples. And see, in the passage I read earlier, where Jesus said the disciples would do greater things than he's reported as saying, "It is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say I am in the Father and the Father is in me." Or at least believe the evidence of the work themselves. And this is the passage that Emerson was referring to when he talked about everybody claiming their access to God. So what are these works of Jesus, of God, that John reports and have? have the disciples exceed him in greatness? Now, the first miracle that John reports is the turning of water into wine. And I've often marveled at what this says about Jesus. Instead of being a pious teacher, he was known as a good host, celebrating life and love. Now, I'm afraid that his disciples have not followed this sign. The drinking of wine became a ritual about drinking blood, hardly a jovial occasion. John's gospel is alone in not reporting the Last Supper, that is, communion. Even Paul, who seldom quotes Jesus in all his letters, quotes Jesus as established in communion. John does not talk about the bread being the body of Christ. He does not speak about the wine being the blood of Christ. Rather, he alone reports that Jesus interrupted the Passover meal to wash his disciples' feet. And this was to show humility. And perhaps this past week, the new pope expanded on the humility of Jesus. Foot washing has become a ritual in Christian circles. And usually during Holy Week, the Pope washes the feet of some priests that are selected to have an audience with him. But this new Pope went down to the juvenile detention center and washed the feet of the prisoners, which included 2 young women, one of whom was Muslim. This broke liturgical law. But being the Pope, he's allowed to do this. Some conservatives fear that by washing the feet of women, he was opening the door to their full discipleship and, heaven forbid, priesthood. They say that the 12 disciples of Jesus were all male. So perhaps the Pope did a work greater than Jesus by including females and a non-Christian. John includes some of the miracles that are found in the other Gospels, such as the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on the water and giving sight to the blind and catching many fish. But one story is only told in the Gospel of John, and that is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. The Gospel of Mark has Jesus reviving a girl presumed to be dead, but Jesus says, "Oh, she's not dead, she's asleep," and then revives her. But the Gospel of John reports that Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days. And when Jesus said, "Open the tomb," people said, "Hey, that's going to smell." But before the tomb was rolled away, the stone of the tomb was rolled away, Jesus proclaimed, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die." And then Lazarus was raised from the dead. Raising people from the dead. Have the disciples of Jesus exceeded Jesus in this task? I'm here to testify that they have. On March 2nd, the heart of my wife, Gail, stopped. It was 30 minutes before they were able to start it again. And once they started it, they did not fully revive her. Instead, they placed her in a medically induced hypothermic coma. They reduced her body temperature to around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the modern equivalent of a cold, dark tomb. And on the third day, she rose out of the coma and into consciousness. We explained what had happened to her as she proclaimed through the morphine and fatigue, "Weird." And indeed it was weird. She had come back from the dead. And while she was sleeping, I walked the halls of the cardiac care unit. And room after room contained resurrection after resurrection. An everyday miracle occurring many times across the nation and around the world. I imagine Gail is not the only one among us here today who has been resurrected from the dead. Many thank God, many thank science, many thank whatever holiness produced the human mind. Many of us now understand how to bring people back from the dead. On the wall behind this pulpit is a holy instrument, waiting to perform resurrections here in this temple. Encased in a red box is a defibrillator. After she died, Gail was defibrillated 3 times. I'm glad Peter wasn't around. He would have denied her 3 times. But what wondrous works these are. I do not know if the medical practitioners were disciples of Jesus, but Jesus said, "Believe in me when I say I am in the Father and the Father is in me," or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. I do believe the evidence of the works. We live in a miraculous age. We catch more fish and feed more people than the disciples of Jesus could imagine. Miraculous people walk around us and we barely notice. Did Jesus know the secret of coming back from the dead? Was the resurrection of Lazarus a dry run for his own resurrection? The Passover Plot, a controversial best-selling 1965 book by British scholar, suggests that he did. And it kind of reminds me of Flatliners, a 1990 movie starring Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, and Kevin Bacon, about medical students who were experimenting with dying and bringing each other back to life. Or perhaps it was unintentional. Perhaps Jesus was removed from the cross prematurely, and the coolness of the cave produced a hypothermic coma, allowing his body to recover. Or maybe it was God raising Lazarus and Jesus from the dead. None of us were there. None of us truly know. All we have is faith and conjecture. But at least we can believe the evidence of the works themselves. Something happened long ago that impressed the disciples of Jesus, and it is still happening today in greater numbers, and that impresses me. We all have the potential to come back from the dead, maybe 2-3 times before we actually die. What shall we do with our extended lives? We are given second chance after second chance to get to know each other, to get to love each other. In the local paper, they often show pictures of 5-generation families. How many of us were held by our great-great-grandmother? My great-grandmother held my brother, but died 2 years before I was born. In the days of Jesus, one was fortunate to know one's grandfather. We are living longer. But are we living better? What are we doing to share generation to generation? May this Easter remind us to look for everyday resurrections. May we receive them gratefully and give them liberally, sharing our lives, giving our lives for the sake of others, giving our lives for a future unknown. Our ancestors are with us always. We will be here always, even until the end of time. May we bless and be blessed.